Number 1. Dennis Rader. Imagine helping the police track down a serial killer, attending community meetings about the case, even talking to your neighbors about how scary it all was. Now imagine you were the killer the entire time. That is exactly what Dennis Rader did for 30 years in Wichita, Kansas. Dennis Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and grew up in a seemingly normal household. He served in the United States Air Force from 1966 to 1970. After leaving the military, he settled in the Wichita area, married his wife Paula in 1971, had 2 children, and built what looked like a perfectly ordinary suburban life. He worked as an installer for ADT Security Services, then later became a compliance officer for Park City, Kansas. He was active in his local church, Christ Lutheran Church, where he served as president of the Congregation Council. He was a Cub Scout leader. He mowed his lawn. He attended neighborhood barbecues. Everyone in his community considered him a reliable, if somewhat rigid man. But behind that carefully polished exterior, Dennis Rader was the BTK Killer, a name he gave himself. BTK stood for Bind, Torture, Kill, and it described exactly what he did to his victims. Between 1974 and 1991, Rader took the lives of 10 people in the Wichita area, and for decades, no one had any idea it was him. His first attack came on January 15, 1974, when he targeted the Otero family. Joseph Otero, Julie Otero, and 2 of their children, Josephine and Joseph Jr., were found deceased in their home. The crime was methodical and deeply disturbing, showing a level of planning that shocked investigators. This was not a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was something else entirely. Wichita police had never dealt with anything like it, and the community was terrified. Then something unusual happened. In October 1974, a local newspaper received a letter. The writer claimed responsibility for the Otero murders and directed police to a letter hidden in a book at the Wichita Public Library. That letter contained details about the crime that only the killer would know. The writer gave himself the name BTK. He wanted credit. He wanted recognition. And most importantly, he wanted to play a game with law enforcement. This was the beginning of one of the most bizarre cat-and-mouse dynamics in American criminal history. Rader did not just commit crimes and hide. He inserted himself into the investigation. He communicated with police and the media through letters and packages. He taunted them with puzzles, poems, and coded messages. He would go quiet for years at a time, then resurface with another communication, reminding Wichita that he was still out there. Over the following years, Rader continued to strike. Catherine Bright was attacked in April 1974, and she tragically lost her life. Her brother Kevin was also attacked but survived, becoming one of the few people to encounter BTK and live. Shirley Vian was killed in March 1977. Nancy Fox was killed in December of that same year. After the Fox murder, Rader actually called police himself to report it, directing them to the victim's address. He wanted to make sure they found her quickly. He wanted the attention. Then Rader went quiet for a long stretch. Maureen Hedge was killed in 1985, Vicky Wagurley in 1986, and Dolores Davis in 1991. After that last murder, BTK seemed to vanish. The letters stopped. The killings stopped. For over a decade, there was nothing. Some investigators wondered if he had died, moved away, or been imprisoned for something else. The case went cold, but it was never forgotten. Wichita lived under a shadow, never knowing for sure if the nightmare was truly over. And here is where the story takes its strangest turn. During all of those years, Dennis Rader was living right there in the community. He was not hiding in a remote cabin. He was not living under a fake identity. He was walking among the very people who feared BTK. He attended community meetings where residents discussed the case. He talked openly about how frightening it all was. He was a compliance officer who enforced local codes and ordinances, someone with a badge and a small amount of authority. People trusted him. People respected him. Some people were even annoyed by how strict he was about lawn maintenance and permit violations. But nobody, not even for a second, suspected he was BTK. Rader later admitted that he enjoyed this dual existence. The thrill of being right there in the middle of it all, knowing what no one else knew, was part of what drove him. He sat in church pews on Sunday mornings, shook hands with his pastor, and went home carrying a secret that would horrify every person he knew. Then in 2004, Rader did something that ultimately ended his freedom. He started communicating again. After 13 years of silence, he began sending letters, packages, and puzzles to the police and local media. Investigators were stunned. BTK was back. The community was gripped with fear once more. But this time, law enforcement had something they did not have in the 1970s. They had modern forensic technology, and they had a renewed determination to catch this man. Rader sent 11 communications between March 2004 and February 2005. He mailed packages to local television stations. He left items in public places for police to find. He dropped cereal boxes containing notes in a Home Depot parking lot. He sent word puzzles, dolls bound with tape to represent his victims, and photocopied pages from his own personal journals. He was escalating his communication, getting bolder and getting careless. One of the most important moments in the investigation came when Rader asked police a question through one of his communications. He wanted to know if they could trace a floppy disk back to him. He actually asked the police if it was safe to communicate using a computer disk. The police, in a move that has become legendary in criminal investigation history, placed a classified ad in the Wichita Eagle newspaper that essentially told him yes, it was safe. They lied. Rader trusted them. In February 2005, a floppy disk was left at a local television station. Investigators examined the disk using forensic software and found metadata embedded in a deleted Microsoft Word document. That metadata contained two key pieces of information. First, the document had been edited by a user named Dennis. Second, the file was linked to Christ Lutheran Church. It took investigators almost no time to connect those dots. A quick search revealed that Dennis Rader was the president of the Congregation Council at Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. They pulled his vehicle registration records, cross-referenced his movements, and quietly collected a DNA sample. Investigators obtained a medical sample from Rader's daughter, who had been treated at Kansas State University's Health Center. DNA testing confirmed a familial match to biological evidence collected at the crime scenes years earlier. The science was undeniable. Dennis Rader was BTK. On February 25, 2005, Rader was arrested during a routine traffic stop near his home. He did not resist. When officers told him he was being arrested in connection with the BTK case, he reportedly looked almost relieved. After 3 decades of living a double life, it was finally over. During his confession, Rader was shockingly calm, even clinical. He described each of his 10 murders in detail, as if he were giving a work presentation. He used the word projects to refer to his victims. He drew diagrams. He showed no emotion, no remorse. The detectives interviewing him later said it was one of the most disturbing experiences of their careers. They had expected anger, denial, maybe even tears. Instead, they got a man who seemed almost proud of what he had done. On June 27, 2005, Dennis Rader stood in a Sedgwick County courtroom and pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. Because Kansas did not have the death penalty at the time of his earliest crimes, he could not be sentenced to death. On August 18, 2005, Judge Gregory Waller sentenced him to 10 consecutive life sentences, with a minimum of 175 years before the possibility of parole. In practical terms, Rader will never leave prison. The sentencing hearing was emotional. Family members of his victims spoke directly to him. They told him about the people he had taken from them. The pain in that courtroom was immense, and it served as a powerful reminder that behind every case number and every statistic, there are real people who lost someone they loved. What made the Rader case so important to the study of criminal behavior was not just the crimes themselves, but the way he operated in plain sight. He did not just avoid detection. He actively participated in the world that was hunting him. He went to meetings. He talked to neighbors. He shook hands with police officers. He embedded himself so deeply into normal community life that no one could see what was right in front of them. The case also became a landmark example of how digital forensic evidence can solve even the coldest of cases. Rader's decision to use a floppy disk and his naive trust in the police when they told him it could not be traced was the single mistake that brought down a 30-year mystery. It proved that even the most careful criminals can be undone by their own arrogance. Dennis Rader is currently serving his sentence at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars. His story is a chilling reminder that the most dangerous people are not always strangers in the shadows. Sometimes they are the ones sitting next to you at church, asking you to keep your hedges trimmed, and smiling at you across the fence. Number 2. John Wayne Gacy. In the late 1970s, the people of Norwood Park Township in unincorporated Cook County, Illinois, knew John Wayne Gacy as a successful businessman, a community organizer, and a man who dressed up as a clown to entertain children at local hospitals and charity events. He went by the name Pogo the Clown. He threw elaborate block parties for his neighbors. He shook hands with politicians. He was even photographed with First Lady Rosalind Carter. To the outside world, John Wayne Gacy was a model citizen. Behind the walls of his ranch-style home at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue, Gacy was hiding something that would shock the entire nation. Buried beneath the crawl space of his home, packed into the foundation itself, were the remains of 26 young men and boys. 3 more victims were found buried elsewhere on his property, and 4 others had been thrown into the Des Plaines River. In total, 33 people lost their lives at his hands between 1972 and 1978, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. But what makes Gacy relevant to this video is not just the scale of his crimes. It is the way he operated in plain sight and even interacted with the very systems that should have caught him. Gacy did not just help police hunt themselves in the traditional sense. He used his standing in the community, his political connections, and his confident public persona to deflect suspicion at every turn. When police came to his door, he invited them in. When detectives questioned him, he played the gracious host. He offered them drinks. He chatted with them as if nothing in the world could be wrong. And all the while, the evidence of his crimes was literally beneath their feet. Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. His childhood was difficult. His father was an alcoholic who was emotionally and physically abusive, particularly toward John. Despite this, Gacy worked hard to build a life for himself. He got involved in local politics as a young man, joined the Jaycees, a civic organization, and was named the organization's Outstanding Man of the Year in Springfield, Illinois, in 1967. He married, had children, and seemed to be building a respectable future, but there were red flags early on. In 1968, Gacy was convicted of sodomy involving a teenage boy in Waterloo, Iowa. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but was paroled after serving just 18 months, partly because of his good behavior and his ability to present himself well to authorities. This was a catastrophic failure of the criminal justice system, because it gave a dangerous predator a second chance to offend on a scale no one could have imagined. After his release, Gacy moved back to Illinois, started a construction company called PDM Contractors, and began building his public image all over again. He hired young men to work for him, many of them teenagers. He became active in Democratic Party politics. He organized the Polish Constitution Day parade in his neighborhood. He was the kind of person everyone knew and most people liked. But young men started disappearing. Between 1972 and 1978, a series of young men and teenage boys vanished from the Chicago area. Some were employees of Gacy's construction company. Some were picked up off the streets. Some were lured with promises of work or money. In many cases, their families reported them missing, but police had difficulty connecting the cases to a single suspect. Gacy, meanwhile, was hiding in plain sight in the most literal sense. When neighbors occasionally commented on a bad smell coming from his property, He explained it away as a moisture issue or a problem with his sewer. When people disappeared from his work crew, he acted surprised and unconcerned. He kept throwing parties, kept performing as Pogo the Clown, and kept building his reputation as a generous, outgoing neighbor. The turning point came in December 1978, when a 15-year-old named Robert Piest disappeared from a pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois. Robert had told his mother he was going to speak with a contractor about a summer job. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Robert's mother went to the police immediately, and Des Plaines investigators began looking into Gacy's background. What they found alarmed them. They discovered his 1968 sodomy conviction in Iowa, which had never come up during his many interactions with law enforcement and local politics. Detectives placed Gacy under 24-hour surveillance. For several days, they followed him everywhere he went. During this time, Gacy did something that still astounds investigators to this day. He invited the officers tailing him to join him for breakfast. He sat across the table from the very detectives who were building a case against him and made casual conversation. He was friendly, relaxed, and charming. He drove around town running errands as if nothing was wrong, even though police were parked right behind him. At one point, he even went to a gas station with a detective and had a normal chat about the holidays. This was Gacy's signature. He used his social skills and his disarming personality to control the narrative. He believed he was smarter than the police, and he acted accordingly. He filed a civil suit against the Des Plaines Police Department, accusing them of harassment. He complained to anyone who would listen that he was being unfairly targeted. He was not running. He was not hiding. He was fighting back, using the legal system itself as a weapon. But the investigation was tightening. On December 22, 1978, investigators obtained a search warrant for Gacy's home. When they entered the crawl space beneath the house, they made a discovery that would become one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. The smell alone told them what they would find. Investigators began the painstaking process of excavating the crawl space and the surrounding property. Over the following weeks and months, the remains of 29 victims were recovered from beneath and around the home. 4 additional victims were identified as having been disposed of in the Des Plaines River. Gacy was arrested that same night. Under interrogation, he initially attempted to play the same confident, talkative role he had always played. But the evidence was overwhelming, and eventually he began confessing. He claimed that many of the killings happened during what he described as blackouts or episodes where he was not fully in control of his actions. Investigators and psychologists largely dismissed this claim as a manipulation tactic, consistent with Gacy's lifelong pattern of presenting himself as something he was not. The trial of John Wayne Gacy began on February 6, 1980, in Cook County. His defense team attempted an insanity plea, arguing that Gacy suffered from multiple personality disorder and was not responsible for his actions. The prosecution presented overwhelming physical evidence, testimony from survivors who had escaped Gacy's attacks, and psychiatric experts who testified that Gacy was fully aware of what he was doing and went to great lengths to conceal it. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 33 counts of murder. Gacy was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row at the Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois, during which time he took up oil painting and gave media interviews, continuing his pattern of seeking public attention. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at the Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. His reported last words were dismissive and showed no remorse. Even after his death, the case continued to demand attention. Several of Gacy's victims remained unidentified for decades. Thanks to advances in DNA technology, the Cook County Sheriff's Office launched the effort to identify the remaining unknown victims. Over the years, several previously unidentified victims were finally given their names back, including William Bundy, identified in 2011 and Francis Wayne Alexander, identified in 2021 using genetic genealogy. As of my last reliable information, some victims still remain unidentified. The Gacy case is a permanent warning about the danger of surface impressions. This was a man who posed for photographs with politicians, who entertained children as a clown, and who filed lawsuits against the police while they were investigating him for mass murder. He did not just help police hunt themselves. He actively tried to rewrite the story while it was still being told. The fact that he very nearly succeeded for so long is a lesson that still resonates with law enforcement to this day. Number 3. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy is one of the most well-known criminal names in American history, and for good reason. Between 1974 and 1978, he was responsible for the deaths of at least 30 young women across multiple states, though the true number may be higher. But what makes Bundy's case so disturbing is not just what he did. It is how long he was able to keep doing it, in part because of his ability to charm, manipulate, and even assist in the very efforts that should have caught him. Theodore Robert Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. He grew up in a complicated family situation. For years, he was led to believe that his grandparents were his parents, and that his mother was his sister. When he eventually learned the truth, it reportedly had a profound effect on him. Despite this difficult start, Bundy was intelligent, articulate, and by all outward appearances, a promising young man. He studied psychology at the University of Washington. He worked at a crisis hotline center. He was involved in Republican politics in Washington state and even worked on a gubernatorial campaign. That last detail is worth pausing on. Ted Bundy, while actively committing some of the worst crimes imaginable, was also working in political campaigns, volunteering at a suicide prevention hotline, and attending law school at the University of Puget Sound. He was not a loner hiding in the margins of society. He was an active, visible member of his community. He dated women openly. He had friends. He attended social functions. People who knew him described him as charming, confident, and even kind. The string of disappearances began in the Pacific Northwest in 1974. Young women, often college students, began vanishing from campuses and public areas in Washington and Oregon. In several cases, witnesses reported seeing a young man with his arm in a sling or wearing a fake cast, asking women for help carrying books or loading items into his Volkswagen Beetle. Bundy used the appearance of vulnerability to lure his victims into a position where they could not escape. What many people do not realize is that during this period, someone who knew Bundy actually reported him to police as a potential suspect. His girlfriend at the time, Elizabeth Klupfer, noticed unsettling things about his behavior and called the King County Police and the Seattle Police. She gave them his name, described his car, and expressed her concerns. His name was added to a list of potential suspects. But because Bundy presented so well, because he was educated, clean-cut, and involved in his community, investigators did not prioritize him. He looked nothing like what they expected a serial predator to look like. This is one of the most tragic aspects of the case. The system had his name. They had information from someone close to him, and yet he slipped through because of assumptions about what a dangerous person should look like. That bias cost lives. Bundy eventually moved to Utah to attend law school at the University of Utah. The disappearances in Washington slowed, but similar cases began appearing in Utah, Colorado, and eventually Florida. In August 1975, Bundy was pulled over by a Utah Highway Patrol officer named Bob Hayward for driving suspiciously in a residential neighborhood late at night. When Hayward searched Bundy's car, he found a ski mask, handcuffs, an ice pick, rope, and other items. Bundy was arrested and eventually connected to the kidnapping of Carol Duranch, a young woman who had managed to escape from him in Murray, Utah, in November 1974. Bundy was convicted of aggravated kidnapping in 1976 and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. But investigators in Colorado were building a case against him for the murder of Karen Campbell, a nurse who had vanished from a ski lodge in Snowmass Village in January 1975. Bundy was transferred to Aspen, Colorado, to face those charges. And here is where Bundy's audacity reached a remarkable level. On June 7, 1977, during a pretrial hearing at the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, Bundy was granted permission to visit the courthouse law library to prepare for his case. He was acting as his own attorney, a role he relished because it gave him attention and control. While in the library, Bundy jumped from a second-floor window and escaped into the mountains surrounding Aspen. He was on the run for 6 days before being recaptured. He was not done. On December 30, 1977, Bundy escaped again, this time from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. He had spent months sawing through the ceiling of his cell with a hacksaw blade, losing enough weight to squeeze through a small opening into the crawl space above. From there, he made his way into a jailer's apartment, changed clothes, and walked out the front door. By the time anyone noticed he was gone, Bundy had a 17-hour head start. He made his way to Tallahassee, Florida, where he would commit his final and most devastating attacks. On January 15, 1978, Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In a matter of minutes, he attacked 4 women, 2 of whom, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, did not survive. 2 others were severely injured. Less than an hour later, he attacked another young woman in a nearby apartment. 3 weeks later, on February 9, 1978, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach was taken from her junior high school in Lake City, Florida. Her body was found weeks later. Bundy was finally arrested on February 15, 1978, in Pensacola, Florida, during a traffic stop. Officer David Lee of the Pensacola Police Department pulled over a stolen Volkswagen and found Bundy behind the wheel. After a brief struggle, Bundy was taken into custody. This time, he would not escape. During his trials in Florida, Bundy again insisted on representing himself, at least in part. He cross-examined witnesses. He made legal arguments. He even proposed to his girlfriend, Carol Ann Boone, during the penalty phase of his trial, exploiting a quirk of Florida law that made a courtroom declaration of marriage legally binding. This theatricality was part of who Bundy was. He used every stage available to him, every camera, every microphone, to project an image of control and intelligence. He wanted the world to see him as extraordinary, even while being judged for monstrous acts. It did not work in the end. The evidence was overwhelming. Bite mark evidence, which was newer forensic science at the time, played a key role in linking Bundy to the Chi Omega attack. Forensic odontologist Richard Souverone matched a bite mark left on victim Lisa Levy to Bundy's dental impressions. Fiber evidence, eyewitness testimony, and circumstantial evidence built a picture the jury could not ignore. On July 24, 1979, Ted Bundy was found guilty of 2 counts of murder and 3 counts of attempted murder in the Chi Omega case. He received the death penalty. In a separate trial in 1980, he was convicted of the murder of Kimberly Leach and received another death sentence. Bundy spent nearly a decade on death row at Florida State Prison. During that time, he gave a series of interviews, most notably to FBI profiler Robert Kessler and to evangelist James Dobson. In his final interviews, Bundy confessed to approximately 30 murders across 7 states, though experts believe the real number could be significantly higher. He provided some details that helped investigators locate the remains of several victims. But many questions remain unanswered. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison in Rayford, Florida. Outside the prison, a crowd gathered and cheered. It was a grim scene, reflecting the deep anger and fear Bundy had caused across the country. The lasting impact of the Bundy case on law enforcement is significant. It directly contributed to the creation of the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, known as VICAP, which was designed to help law enforcement agencies across the country share information about violent crimes. Before VICAP, serial offenders like Bundy could move from state to state, and police departments had no efficient way to connect the dots. Bundy exploited that weakness. and the system changed because of it. His case is also a permanent lesson about the danger of assumptions. Bundy did not look like a monster. He looked like a law student. He looked like a campaign volunteer. He looked like the kind of guy your parents would have approved of, and that was precisely what made him so dangerous. The idea that dangerous people always look dangerous is one of the most harmful myths in criminal justice, and Ted Bundy is the living proof of why that myth costs lives. Number 4. Ian Huntley. On August 4, 2002, 10-year-old Holly Wells and 10-year-old Jessica Chapman left a family barbecue in Soham, a small town in Cambridgeshire, England. They were wearing matching Manchester United football shirts. They walked to a nearby convenience store to buy some sweets, and after that, they were never seen alive again. The disappearance of Holly and Jessica became one of the biggest news stories in British history. The entire country watched and waited for news. Police launched a massive search operation. Volunteers combed fields and footpaths. The media covered the case around the clock. Posters of the two girls were everywhere. And right in the middle of it all, giving interviews to television cameras, expressing concern for the missing children, and offering his help to the investigation, was Ian Huntley. Huntley was the caretaker at Soham Village College, the local secondary school. He was known in the community. He lived with his girlfriend, Maxine Carr, who was a teaching assistant at the primary school Holly and Jessica attended. After the girls went missing, Huntley inserted himself directly into the public response. He spoke to television reporters, appearing concerned and eager to help. He told journalists that he had been one of the last people to see the girls, claiming they had walked past his house that evening. He described how he hoped they would be found safe. He was calm, cooperative, and appeared genuinely distressed. What no one realized at the time was that Huntley was not just a witness. He was the person responsible for their deaths. Holly and Jessica had walked past his home, and he had lured them inside. What exactly happened in that house remains partly unclear, as Huntley changed his story multiple times, but the outcome was devastating. Both girls lost their lives inside his home. He then drove their bodies to a remote area near the village of Lakenheath in Suffolk, beside a path near an RAF base. He set fire to the remains and concealed them in a ditch. For 13 days, Huntley continued to live his life in Soham, participating in the search and speaking to the press, while knowing exactly where the children were. He even attended a community vigil. He spoke to officers involved in the investigation. He maintained his role as a concerned local for nearly 2 weeks. Meanwhile, the investigation was expanding rapidly. The case was assigned to Detective Superintendent David Beck of the Cambridgeshire Police, and it became one of the most resource-intensive missing persons investigations ever conducted in England. Thousands of people were interviewed. CCTV footage was collected from across the region. Phone records were analyzed. One of the early breaks came from CCTV footage captured at a sports center in Soham. The footage showed Holly and Jessica walking along a street near Huntley's home on the evening they disappeared. This helped investigators narrow down the timeline and the area where the girls were last seen. It also put the focus squarely on the area around Huntley's residence. As detectives began looking more closely at Huntley, they discovered something alarming. He had a history that should have prevented him from ever working near children. Before moving to Soham, Huntley had been the subject of multiple allegations involving underage girls and young women in the Humberside area. Humberside police had received complaints about him on several occasions. However, due to a series of failures in record-keeping and communication between police forces, these allegations were not properly flagged. When Huntley applied for the caretaker position at Soham Village College, a standard background check came back clean. This failure became one of the most significant elements of the case and led to a complete overhaul of how background checks were conducted for people working with children in England. On August 17, 2002, a game warden discovered the remains of Holly and Jessica near Lakenheath. The charred Manchester United shirts were found in a bin at the school where Huntley worked as caretaker. Forensic examination confirmed the worst fears of the entire nation. Both girls had been murdered. Huntley was arrested on August 17, 2002. His girlfriend Maxine Carr was also arrested. Carr had provided a false alibi for Huntley, telling police that she had been at home with him on the night of August 4, when in fact she had been in Grimsby visiting family. She claimed she had lied to protect Huntley, but insisted she did not know about the murders. This claim was heavily scrutinized but ultimately accepted by the court for the purposes of the charges against her. The trial began on November 3, 2003, at the Old Bailey in London. Huntley's defense team argued that the deaths were accidental, claiming that Holly had suffered a nosebleed while visiting his house and that he accidentally caused her death while trying to help. He said Jessica began screaming and he silenced her in a panic. This account was widely disbelieved by prosecutors, forensic experts, and ultimately the jury. The deliberate concealment of the bodies, the burning of evidence, and Huntley's prolonged deception all pointed to guilt. On December 17, 2003, Ian Huntley was found guilty of 2 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 2 concurrent terms of life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 40 years. This meant he would not be eligible for parole until at least 2042. Maxine Carr was convicted of conspiring to pervert the course of justice and sentenced to 3.5 years in prison. After her release, she was given a new identity and lifetime anonymity by the British courts, one of only a handful of people to receive such protection. The aftermath of the Soham murders was enormous. An independent inquiry led by Sir Michael Bichard examined the failures that allowed Huntley to work near children, despite his history. The Bichard inquiry, published in June 2004, found systemic failures in the way police forces shared intelligence and how background checks were conducted. It led to the creation of the National Policing Improvement Agency and eventually the Disclosure and Barring Service, which now handles enhanced background checks for anyone working with children or vulnerable adults in England and Wales. The case also changed how the British public thought about community trust. Huntley was not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was a local figure, someone people recognized and interacted with daily. The fact that he stood in front of television cameras, performed the role of a concerned neighbor, and actively participated in the search for children he had already killed was a level of deception that shook the nation to its core. Ian Huntley remains in prison. He has been attacked by fellow inmates on multiple occasions and reportedly attempted to end his own life more than once. The pain he caused to the families of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman and to the town of Soham is permanent. The Soham case is a harsh reminder that the person who seems most eager to help is sometimes the one who has the most to hide. Huntley wanted to be seen as cooperative, as innocent, as just another worried neighbor. He gave interviews, he answered questions, he played the part perfectly. But the truth was hiding in plain sight, and when it finally came out, it changed an entire country's approach to protecting its children. Number 5. Edmund Kemper. Edmund Emil Kemper III stands 6 feet 9 inches tall and weighs over 250 pounds. He has an IQ estimated at around 145. He is articulate, well-spoken, and has been described by FBI agents and detectives as one of the most cooperative and insightful serial offenders they have ever interviewed. He is also responsible for the deaths of 10 people, including his own mother. What makes Kemper particularly relevant to this video is that he literally walked into a police station and confessed, and the police did not believe him. He had to call back multiple times before anyone took him seriously. And before that, he had spent months socializing with the very officers who were investigating the series of disappearances he was causing. Kemper was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California. His childhood was deeply troubled. His parents had a volatile relationship, and his mother, Clarnell Kemper, was by many accounts emotionally abusive and psychologically cruel. She belittled Edmund constantly, told him he was worthless, and at one point forced him to sleep in a locked basement because she feared he would harm his sisters. Whether that fear was justified or born from her own instability, the environment was toxic. Young Edmund began showing disturbing behavior early, including acts of cruelty toward animals. At the age of 15, Kemper committed an act that should have been a permanent warning signal. On August 27, 1964, he shot and killed both of his paternal grandparents at their ranch in North Fork, California. When asked why he had done it, Kemper reportedly said he wanted to see what it felt like. He was committed to the Atascadero State Hospital for the criminally insane, where he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He spent 5 years there, and during that time, he did something that would have a disturbing impact on his future crimes. He was assigned to work alongside the psychologists administering tests to other patients. He learned how the evaluation system worked. He learned what answers the doctors wanted to hear. He learned how to present himself as recovered, insightful, and no longer dangerous. In 1969, at the age of 21, Kemper was released from Atascadero against the recommendation of several doctors. His juvenile records were sealed, and he was placed in the custody of his mother, who was living in Santa Cruz, California. This decision was, in hindsight, catastrophic. In Santa Cruz, Kemper began building a life that, on the surface, looked unremarkable. He worked a series of jobs and eventually secured a position with the California Department of Transportation. He bought a car, he socialized, and most notably, he began spending a significant amount of time at a bar called the Jury Room, which was located near the Santa Cruz County Courthouse. This bar was a favorite hangout for local police officers, lawyers, and investigators. Kemper became a regular there. He drank with off-duty cops. He chatted with detectives. He was known to them as Big Ed, a friendly, talkative giant who was genuinely interested in police work. He asked them about their cases. They answered freely, never suspecting that the man buying them drinks was the person they were looking for. Between May 1972 and April 1973, Kemper picked up and murdered 6 female hitchhikers in the Santa Cruz area. The victims were Mary Ann Pesci, Anita Lucchesa, Aiko Koo, Cindy Schall, Rosalind Thorpe, and Alice Liu. Most were college students. Kemper would pick them up along the highways and roads leading to and from the University of California, Santa Cruz. He was large, well-spoken, and drove a car with a university parking sticker. To young hitchhikers, he did not seem threatening. During this period, Santa Cruz was experiencing an unprecedented wave of violent crime. In addition to Kemper's victims, 2 other serial offenders were active in the area at roughly the same time: Herbert Mullen and John Linley Frazier. Police were overwhelmed, and the public was terrified. The media began calling Santa Cruz murder capital of the world. And through all of it, Edmund Kemper was sitting at the Jury Room bar, talking to the investigators who were trying to solve his crimes. He would ask about the cases. He would listen to their theories. He would nod sympathetically. He would offer his thoughts. Detectives later admitted that they had discussed details of the investigation with him, not realizing they were essentially briefing the killer on how close or how far they were from catching him. This was not just arrogance, though it certainly was that too. Kemper was also gathering intelligence. He learned what evidence the police had. He learned what investigative techniques they were using. He learned where their attention was focused, and he used that information to stay one step ahead. On Easter weekend in April 1973, Kemper's violence reached its most personal. On Good Friday, April 20, he attacked and killed his mother, Clarnell, in her home. He then called his mother's friend, Sally Hallett, to the house and killed her as well. After these acts, Kemper did not run. He did not hide. He got in his car and drove east. He drove all the way to Pueblo, Colorado, listening to the radio the entire time, expecting to hear news of a massive manhunt for him. But there was nothing. No news. No alert. No one was looking for him. Frustrated and, in his own later telling, almost disappointed, Kemper pulled into a phone booth in Pueblo and called the Santa Cruz Police Department. He told them who he was. He told them what he had done. The officer on the phone did not believe him. Kemper was known to the department as Big Ed, the friendly guy from the bar. They thought it was a joke or a prank. Kemper hung up and called back. Again, skepticism. He called a third time and insisted they take him seriously. Finally, a detective who knew him agreed to stay on the line, and Kemper gave enough details to convince them that this was real. Kemper was arrested in Pueblo and extradited back to Santa Cruz. Once in custody, he was extraordinarily forthcoming. He confessed to all of his crimes in extensive detail. He answered every question. He provided information that allowed investigators to recover evidence and remains. His cooperation was so complete that it became a case study in criminal psychology. Kemper seemed to want to be caught. He later said that calling the police was a decision he made, because he knew he would not stop on his own. The trial took place in October and November of 1973. Kemper pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense argued that his troubled childhood, his history of mental illness, and his time in a psychiatric institution demonstrated that he was not in control of his actions. The prosecution countered that Kemper's methodical planning, his ability to evade detection, and his strategic socializing with police all demonstrated a man who was fully aware of what he was doing and took deliberate steps to avoid consequences. The jury agreed with the prosecution. On November 8, 1973, Edmund Kemper was found guilty on 8 counts of first-degree murder. When asked by the judge what he thought his punishment should be, Kemper reportedly said he should be tortured to death. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Kemper has been eligible for parole multiple times over the decades and has been denied each time. In several hearings, he has reportedly stated that he does not believe he should be released, acknowledging that he would remain a danger. He has spent his time in prison recording audiobooks for the blind, earning praise for his clear and articulate reading voice. He is currently incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, California. The Kemper case is studied extensively by the FBI and criminal psychologists because of the window it provides into how a highly intelligent offender can manipulate the people around him. Kemper did not just hide from the police. He befriended them. He drank with them. He learned from them. And when he was finally ready to stop, he had to practically beg them to arrest him. If you are finding these stories as fascinating as they are unsettling, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and let us know which case has surprised you the most so far. Your support helps us keep making content like this. Number 6. Gary Ridgway. For nearly 20 years, someone was killing women along the Pacific Highway South Corridor near Seattle and Tacoma, Washington, and leaving their remains near the Green River. Police knew they had a serial offender on their hands. Task forces were formed. Suspects were investigated. The media reported on every development, and during all of that time, Gary Leon Ridgway, the man who would eventually confess to more murders than almost any other person in American history, passed a polygraph test administered by the very task force hunting for him. Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah, and raised in the SeaTac area of Washington state. He was by most accounts an unremarkable man. He was not particularly intelligent, not particularly charming, and not particularly memorable. He worked as a truck painter at the Kenworth Truck Company for over 30 years. He was married 3 times. He attended church regularly. He read the Bible. Neighbors and coworkers described him as quiet, a little odd, but mostly harmless. The Green River killings, as they came to be known, began in the summer of 1982. On July 15, 1982, the body of Wendy Lee Offield, a 16-year-old, was found in the Green River near Kent, Washington. Over the following months, more bodies were discovered in and around the river. By the end of 1982, 5 women had been found in the Green River alone. The King County Sheriff's Office formed the Green River Task Force, one of the largest serial murder investigations in American history at that time. The victims shared certain characteristics. Many were young women involved in sex work or who lived on the margins of society. They were vulnerable. They were often not reported missing right away, and when they were, the cases did not always receive the same level of attention that other missing persons cases did. Ridgway later admitted that he targeted these women specifically because he knew they were less likely to be missed. This is an important and deeply troubling aspect of the case. The Green River killings exposed a systemic problem in how certain victims are treated by both the media and law enforcement. When the victims are young, white, and from affluent families, cases tend to get intense attention. When the victims are women of color, women living in poverty, or women involved in sex work, the response is often slower and quieter. The Green River case forced a painful conversation about who society considers worthy of protection, and that conversation continues to this day. Throughout the 1980s, the task force investigated thousands of leads and interviewed hundreds of suspects. Gary Ridgway's name first appeared on their radar in 1983 when a woman told police that Ridgway had been violent with her. He was questioned and released. In 1984, he was brought in again after being spotted frequently in areas where victims had last been seen. He agreed to take a polygraph test, and he passed it. This was a significant moment. The polygraph result effectively moved Ridgway down the list of suspects, allowing him to continue killing for years. In 1987, investigators collected a saliva sample from Ridgway as part of the investigation. DNA testing was still in its infancy at the time, and the technology was not yet advanced enough to make a definitive match. The sample was preserved, but for the time being, the investigation had stalled. Meanwhile, bodies continued to appear. The task force expanded and then, due to budget constraints, shrank. Investigators came and went. Careers were built and broken by this case. Detective Tom Jensen and Detective Jim Doyon became two of the most persistent voices on the task force, continuing to push for progress, even when the case seemed hopeless. Ridgway, during all of this, went about his life. He went to work. He attended church. He married his third wife, Judith, in 1988, and by all accounts was a reasonably attentive husband and stepfather. He mowed the lawn. He watched television. He lived in a modest house in the Auburn area. No one around him had any idea that he was responsible for the deaths of dozens of women. In fact, Ridgway later revealed that he deliberately cultivated an image of normalcy. He went to church specifically to create the impression of being a moral, God-fearing man. He maintained regular habits and routines. He was, in his own disturbing way, constructing an alibi made of ordinary life. The breakthrough finally came in 2001. Advances in DNA technology had made it possible to retest old evidence with much greater precision. The saliva sample collected from Ridgway in 1987 was submitted for modern DNA analysis and compared against biological evidence found on several of the earliest victims. The results were conclusive. Gary Leon Ridgway was the Green River Killer. On November 30th, 2001, Ridgway was arrested outside the Kenworth truck plant where he had worked for decades. His co-workers were stunned. His wife was devastated. His neighbors could not believe it. The quiet, church-going truck painter was responsible for one of the longest and deadliest serial murder campaigns in American history. Following his arrest, Ridgway entered into plea negotiations with the King County Prosecutor's Office. The deal was controversial but ultimately practical. In exchange for pleading guilty and providing information about the location of still missing victims, Ridgway would be spared the death penalty. Prosecutors agreed because, for many of the families, knowing where their loved ones were buried was more important than the manner of Ridgway's punishment. On November 5, 2003, Gary Ridgway stood in a King County courtroom and pleaded guilty to 48 counts of murder. He later confessed to additional killings, bringing his acknowledged total to at least 49. This made him one of the most prolific convicted serial killers in United States history. During his allocution, he read a statement in which he expressed what he described as remorse. Many in the courtroom were skeptical. Family members of victims confronted him directly, and several of those statements became some of the most powerful moments of courtroom testimony ever recorded in an American murder case. He was sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. An additional life sentence was added in 2011 after the remains of another victim were identified. Ridgway is currently serving his sentence at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. The Green River case transformed how serial murder investigations are conducted. It demonstrated the limits of polygraph testing, the critical importance of preserving biological evidence for future testing, and the danger of allowing investigative bias to narrow the suspect pool too early. It also sparked a lasting conversation about victim hierarchies and the way society values certain lives over others. Gary Ridgway passed a lie detector test. He lived an ordinary life. He went to church and shook hands with his neighbors every Sunday. And for 20 years, he was the most dangerous person in the Pacific Northwest. His case is a reminder that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up in a pickup truck, wearing a work uniform, with a Bible on the dashboard. Number 7. Russell Williams. Colonel David Russell Williams was one of the most decorated and trusted officers in the Canadian Armed Forces. He was the commanding officer of Canadian Forces Base Trenton, the busiest military airfield in Canada. He piloted VIP flights, carrying the Prime Minister of Canada, the Queen of England, and other heads of state. He was admired by his colleagues, respected by his community, and trusted with some of the most sensitive responsibilities in the Canadian military. He was also a burglar, a predator, and a murderer who kept meticulous records of his crimes, and who, for a time, participated in the very fabric of community life that his actions were destroying. Williams was born on March 7, 1963, in Bromsgrove, Worcestershire, England. His family moved to Canada when he was young, and he grew up in a series of small communities in Ontario. He attended Upper Canada College, a prestigious private school in Toronto, and later studied economics and political science at the University of Toronto. He joined the Canadian Forces in 1987 and rose steadily through the ranks, eventually becoming a colonel in 2004. His career was exemplary. He received numerous commendations and awards. He was placed in positions of increasing authority and trust. By the time he was given command of CFB Trenton in July 2009, he was considered one of the finest officers in the Canadian military. But behind that polished exterior, Williams was leading a secret life that had been escalating for years. Beginning in 2007, he started breaking into homes in the Tweed, Ontario area, where he owned a cottage. At first, his crimes were nonviolent. He broke into the homes of women and girls, stealing undergarments and taking photographs of himself wearing them. He documented everything obsessively, keeping detailed digital records, including photographs and written logs. Over time, the break-ins escalated. In September 2009, Williams broke into a home in Tweed and physically assaulted the female occupant. In November 2009, he did the same to another woman. These were no longer burglaries. They were violent attacks, and the community was terrified. The Ontario Provincial Police launched an investigation, but the perpetrators seemed to leave little trace. Residents installed extra locks, bought security cameras, and checked on their neighbors. And then things got much worse. On November 25, 2009, Corporal Marie-France Comeau, a military flight attendant based at CFB Trenton, was found dead in her home in Brighton, Ontario. She had been bound and assaulted before being killed. The case was deeply disturbing, not just because of the crime itself, but because Comeau was a member of the military. Someone in or connected to the military community was a strong possibility. On January 28, 2010, Jessica Lloyd, a 27-year-old woman, disappeared from her home near Belleville, Ontario. Her car was still in the driveway. Her belongings were untouched. She had simply vanished. The community was gripped with fear. What people in the area did not know was that their commanding officer at the local military base was responsible for all of it. Williams had been moving through the community as both a leader and a predator simultaneously. He attended remembrance ceremonies. He stood in formation. He issued orders and signed documents. And at night, he broke into homes. The investigation into Jessica Lloyd's disappearance led to a crucial piece of evidence. Tire tracks found near her home were identified as coming from a specific type of tire used on certain SUVs. Ontario Provincial Police Detective Sergeant Jim Smith and his team began cross-referencing vehicle registrations in the area with the tire type. Colonel Russell Williams's Nissan Pathfinder was identified as a match. On February 7, 2010, Williams was asked to come to the Ottawa police station for an interview. He believed it was a routine conversation. What followed was one of the most remarkable interrogation sessions in Canadian criminal history. Detective Sergeant Jim Smith conducted the interview, and the entire session was recorded and later made public. Smith began calmly, methodically, and respectfully. He laid out the evidence piece by piece. He showed Williams photographs of the tire tracks. He explained the forensic connections. He spoke quietly, almost conversationally, but with absolute precision. Over the course of several hours, Williams's composure cracked. He went from denial to deflection to silence, and then he began to confess. Williams admitted to the murders of Marie-France Comeau and Jessica Lloyd. He admitted to the sexual assaults. He admitted to 82 counts of breaking and entering. He told investigators where to find Jessica Lloyd's body. He showed no significant emotion, but he was thorough. He answered questions in the same organized, methodical manner he had used throughout his military career. Jessica Lloyd's body was recovered from a rural area outside of Tweed, based on directions Williams provided. The recovery of her remains confirmed the details of his confession. The scale of his crimes was staggering. When investigators searched his home, they found thousands of photographs documenting his break-ins and assaults, along with stolen undergarments sorted and labeled. He had kept a running catalog of his crimes, organized with the same precision he applied to his military duties. The collection was so extensive that it took investigators considerable time to process it all. On October 18, 2010, Russell Williams appeared in a Belleville, Ontario, courtroom and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of sexual assault, 2 counts of forcible confinement, and 82 counts of breaking and entering. He was sentenced to 2 concurrent life sentences with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Under Canadian law, he will be eligible for a parole hearing in 2035, though the likelihood of release is considered extremely low. Following the sentencing, the Canadian Armed Forces took the unprecedented step of stripping Williams of his rank, his commission, and his medals. His uniform was burned. His military record was effectively erased. Chief of Defense Staff General Walter Natinsik publicly stated that Williams had disgraced the uniform and that his actions were a betrayal of everything the military stands for. The Williams case sent shockwaves through Canada. It challenged fundamental assumptions about trust, authority, and the ability of institutions to identify threats from within. This was not a marginalized individual on the fringes of society. This was one of the most senior officers in the Canadian military, a man entrusted with national secrets, who flew the Prime Minister and the Queen. The cognitive dissonance between who he appeared to be and who he actually was remains deeply disturbing. The case also became a model for interrogation technique. The Jim Smith interview is now used as a training tool in law enforcement academies across Canada and internationally. Smith's calm, methodical approach, building the case piece by piece, giving the suspect room to talk, never raising his voice, and never resorting to aggression, is considered a masterclass in how to obtain a confession ethically and effectively. Russell Williams is currently incarcerated at the maximum security Port Cartier institution in Quebec. He is kept in protective custody due to the nature of his crimes and his high public profile. The communities of Tweed, Brighton, and Belleville continue to live with the memory of what happened. The families of Marie-France Comeau and Jessica Lloyd have shown extraordinary courage in speaking publicly about their losses and advocating for victims. The Williams case is a stark example of how authority itself can become a disguise. He did not just blend into the community. He led it. He was the person in charge. And that position of power made it almost unthinkable that he could be responsible for the horrors unfolding around him. When trust in authority becomes blind, it creates the perfect conditions for that authority to be abused. Number 8. Joanna Dennehy. On March 29, 2013, Kevin Lee's body was found in a ditch near Newborough, Cambridgeshire, England. He was dressed in a distinctive way that was clearly intended to humiliate him. He had been fatally stabbed. 2 days earlier, the bodies of Lukas Slaboszewski and John Chapman had been discovered in ditches near Peterborough. All three men had been killed within a span of about 10 days, and the person responsible was a 31-year-old woman named Joanna Dennehy. What makes Dennehy's case particularly relevant to this video is not just the fact that she killed 3 men in rapid succession, but what happened after those killings. Rather than going into hiding, Dennehy went on a spree. She traveled to Hereford, over 100 miles away, and attacked 2 more men in broad daylight, stabbing them and leaving them for dead. Both survived, but the attacks were brazen and seemingly random. And during the period between the murders and her eventual capture, Dennehy was out in the open, socializing, drinking in pubs, and moving through public spaces as if nothing had happened. Joanna Christine Dennehy was born on August 29, 1982, in St. Albans, Hertfordshire, England. Her childhood was described by her family as difficult. She ran away from home at a young age and became involved in petty crime and substance abuse. She had 2 daughters but was largely absent from their lives. By the time she reached her late 20s, she was living a transient existence, moving between various accommodations in the Peterborough area. In early 2013, Dennehy was living in a bedsit in Peterborough and had become associated with a group of men who would become either her victims or her accomplices. Her first victim was Lukas Slaboszewski, a 31-year-old Polish man whom she had befriended. On or around March 19, 2013, she lured him to a property and stabbed him fatally. She then enlisted the help of 2 men she knew, Gary Stretch and Leslie Layton, to help dispose of the body. Stretch, whose real name was Gary Richards, was a large man who was reportedly infatuated with Dennehy and willing to do whatever she asked. Just days later, on March 29, Dennehy killed John Chapman, a 56-year-old man who lived in a bedsit in the same building. She then killed Kevin Lee, a 48-year-old landlord who had been in a personal relationship with her. The 3 murders happened within approximately 10 days, and they were carried out with a kind of cold indifference that stunned investigators. After the killings, Dennehy did not attempt to flee the country or go into hiding in any meaningful way. Instead, she and Stretch drove to Hereford, apparently at random. On April 2013, while walking along a road in Hereford, Dennehy approached Robin Bereza, a 63-year-old man who was walking his dog. Without warning, she stabbed him repeatedly. She then walked a short distance and attacked John Rogers, a 56-year-old man who was out for a stroll. Both men were seriously injured but survived. The brazenness of these attacks shocked the community. Dennehy had no connection to Hereford and no apparent reason for choosing it. She appeared to be killing and attacking people simply because she wanted to. The investigation moved rapidly. Police identified Dennehy as the suspect through forensic evidence at the Peterborough crime scenes and witness statements. Her association with Stretch and Layton was uncovered, and a nationwide alert was issued. On April 2, 2013, the same day as the Hereford attacks, Dennehy and Stretch were stopped by police in a green Vauxhall Astra on the M1 motorway. Dennehy was arrested without significant resistance. During the investigation, a disturbing picture emerged. Dennehy showed no remorse whatsoever. She was described by those who encountered her in custody as cheerful, almost giddy. She smiled in her mugshot. She made jokes. She expressed no regret for what she had done. In fact, she seemed proud. Forensic psychiatrists who evaluated Dennehy diagnosed her with antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy. She was assessed as having one of the highest psychopathy scores ever recorded for a female offender. She told a mental health professional that she killed because she wanted to, and that she found it pleasurable. There was no delusional thinking, no psychotic break, no claim of self-defense. She was fully aware of what she was doing and simply did not care. Gary Stretch was found guilty of 3 counts of preventing the lawful burial of a body and 2 counts of attempted murder, as he had driven Dennehy to Hereford and was present during the attacks on Bereza and Rogers. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years. Leslie Layton was found guilty of perverting the course of justice and preventing lawful burial and was sentenced to 14 years. On November 28, 2013, Joanna Dennehy pleaded guilty at the Old Bailey to 3 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 1 count of preventing the lawful burial of a body. The guilty plea meant there was no trial on the facts, and the case proceeded directly to sentencing. On February 28, 2014, Mr. Justice Spencer sentenced Dennehy to a whole life order, meaning she will never be eligible for release. She became only the 3rd woman in English legal history to receive a whole life tariff, following Myra Hindley and Rosemary West. The judge described her as a cruel, calculating, selfish, and manipulative serial killer. Dennehy is currently incarcerated at HMP Bronzefield, a women's prison in Ashford, Surrey. She has reportedly shown no interest in rehabilitation or remorse. The case of Joanna Dennehy is significant for several reasons. It challenged gender-based assumptions about violent crime. Serial killing is overwhelmingly associated with male offenders, and the rarity of female serial killers sometimes leads to a dangerous complacency. Dennehy's case proved that predatory violence is not limited by gender, and that dismissing the possibility of a female perpetrator can cost lives. It also illustrated how some offenders operate in plain sight, not because they are clever or sophisticated, but because they simply do not care about being caught. Dennehy walked the streets, went to pubs, and attacked strangers in broad daylight. She was not playing a careful game of deception. She was acting on impulse, and the speed of her violence was itself a kind of camouflage, because no one expected it. The families of her victims have spoken publicly about their grief and their frustration with a system that allowed Dennehy to be living unsupervised in the community despite her troubled history. Their voices are an important part of this story because they remind us that behind every case, there are people who will carry this pain for the rest of their lives. Number 9. Robert Durst. Robert Durst was born into one of the wealthiest real estate families in New York City. His father, Seymour Durst, built an empire of commercial property in Manhattan. Robert was the eldest son and expected to one day lead the family business. He attended Lehigh University and later studied at the University of California, Los Angeles. He married Kathleen McCormack in 1973, and they lived a life of wealth and privilege in the New York area. But behind the wealth, something deeply troubling was taking shape. And over the course of more than 3 decades, Robert Durst would be connected to 3 separate cases of violence, each one stranger than the last. And he would remain free for most of his life because of his money, his lawyers, and his ability to manipulate every situation he found himself in. The first case involved his wife, Kathleen. On January 31, 1982, Kathleen Durst disappeared. She was 29 years old and a medical student at the time. Robert told police that he had put her on a train from their home in South Salem, New York, to Manhattan, and that he never saw her again. Kathleen was reported missing, but her body was never found. Police in Westchester County investigated the case, but without a body and with limited forensic tools available at the time, the investigation stalled. Friends and family of Kathleen were deeply suspicious of Robert. They said the marriage had been deteriorating. They said Kathleen was afraid. They said she had told friends that if anything happened to her, they should look at her husband. But Robert Durst was wealthy, well-connected, and had excellent attorneys. The case went cold for nearly 2 decades. The disappearance of Kathleen Durst remained an open question. Then in 2000, a new investigation was opened by Westchester County prosecutors. Janine Pirro, the district attorney at the time, pushed to re-examine the case with fresh eyes. The renewed scrutiny made Durst nervous, and that nervousness led to a chain of events that exposed just how far he would go to protect himself. Around this same time, a filmmaker named Andrei Chikatilo was making a feature film inspired by the Durst family's story. The film, called All Good Things, starred Ryan Gosling and Kirsten Dunst and was released in 2010. But more important than the film itself was what happened afterward. Jarecki became fascinated with the real story behind the fiction, and he began working on a documentary series that would become one of the most extraordinary pieces of true crime journalism ever produced. But before the documentary, there was the case of Susan Berman. Susan was a close friend of Robert Durst. She was the daughter of a Las Vegas organized crime figure and had become a writer and journalist. Importantly, Susan Berman was believed to have provided a false alibi for Durst at the time of Kathleen's disappearance. When investigators reopened the Kathleen Durst case in 2000, they wanted to speak with Susan. On December 24, 2000, Susan Berman was found dead in her home in Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles. She had been shot once in the back of the head. The execution-style nature of the killing immediately raised suspicions, and Robert Durst quickly became a person of interest. But once again, there was insufficient evidence to charge him, and so, once again, Durst walked away. Then came the strangest chapter yet. In September 2001, Durst was living in Galveston, Texas, disguised as a mute woman named Dorothy Siner. He rented a room in a low-income boarding house, wore women's clothing, and told neighbors he could not speak. He was hiding from the scrutiny generated by the renewed investigations into Kathleen's disappearance and Susan Berman's death. His neighbor in the boarding house was a 71-year-old man named Morris Black. On September 28, 2001, Morris Black was killed. His dismembered remains were found floating in Galveston Bay in garbage bags. The head was never recovered. Durst was identified as the primary suspect, and he fled Texas before he could be arrested. He was captured weeks later in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, after being caught shoplifting a chicken sandwich from a Wegmans grocery store, despite having over $37,000 in cash in his car. At his trial in Galveston in 2003, Durst's defense team argued that the killing of Morris Black was an act of self-defense, and that the dismemberment was done in a panic. Despite the extraordinary circumstances of the case, the jury acquitted Durst of murder. It was a result that stunned legal observers and left many questioning whether Durst's wealth and legal resources had once again insulated him from consequences. And then came the documentary. Andrei Chikatilo spent years interviewing Durst for what would become The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, a 6-part HBO documentary series that premiered in February 2015. Chikatilo approached Durst directly and, remarkably, Durst agreed to sit down for extensive on-camera interviews. Why he agreed remains a subject of debate. Some believe he was arrogant enough to think he could outsmart the filmmakers. Others believe he was compelled by the same narcissistic need for attention that had marked so much of his life. Over the course of the series, Chikatilo presented evidence, testimony, and analysis that built a damning picture. In the final episode, which aired on March 15, 2015, the most explosive moment in true crime documentary history occurred. After his final interview, Durst went to the bathroom while still wearing a wireless microphone. Not realizing the mic was still recording, he muttered to himself. The words he spoke were captured clearly. "What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." This so-called hot mic moment sent shockwaves around the world. Within 24 hours of the episode airing, Robert Durst was arrested in New Orleans on a warrant issued by the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office for the murder of Susan Berman. He had been found in a hotel room with a fake identification, a latex mask, a revolver, marijuana, and over $40,000 in cash. The case against Durst for Berman's murder took years to reach trial, delayed by legal maneuvering and the global pandemic. The trial finally began in March 2021 in Los Angeles County Superior Court. Prosecutors presented a detailed case, arguing that Durst killed Berman to prevent her from telling investigators what she knew about Kathleen's disappearance. The evidence included the hot mic confession, handwriting analysis linking Durst to an anonymous note sent to police directing them to Berman's body, testimony from witnesses who described Durst's behavior before and after the killing, and circumstantial evidence tying the three cases together. On September 17, 2021, the jury found Robert Durst guilty of first-degree murder in the killing of Susan Berman. On October 14, 2021, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On January 10, 2022, Robert Durst died at the age of 78 at a state prison medical facility in Stockton, California. He had been suffering from multiple health problems, including bladder cancer and esophageal cancer. The Durst case is a disturbing illustration of how wealth can distort justice. For decades, Robert Durst was able to evade accountability through expensive legal representation, geographic mobility, and the sheer audacity of his behavior. He quite literally participated in a documentary that examined his own crimes, seemingly unable to resist the spotlight, even when it threatened to expose him. The case also forced a public reckoning with how differently the justice system treats people based on their economic status. A man with fewer resources, who had been connected to 3 separate deaths, who had been caught with a dismembered body in garbage bags, would almost certainly not have spent decades as a free man. Durst's story is uncomfortable, precisely because it reveals truths about the American justice system that many people would prefer not to confront. And perhaps most memorably, it was his own voice, captured on a microphone he did not know was on, that finally sealed his fate. In the end, Robert Durst helped solve his own case by simply being unable to keep quiet. Number 10, Andrei Chikatilo. Between 1978 and 1990, someone was killing people across the Rostov Oblast region of the Soviet Union and leaving their remains in forests, ravines, and wooded areas near train stations. The killer targeted women and children, often approaching them at bus stops and railway platforms, luring them away with promises of food or gifts. Over the course of 12 years, 52 people lost their lives, and the man responsible, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo, was a school teacher, a Communist Party member, and a seemingly unremarkable bureaucrat who passed through police checkpoints and was even arrested and released during the investigation because the system failed to connect the dots. Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in Yabluchny, a small village in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. He grew up during the aftermath of the Holodomor, the devastating famine that killed millions in Ukraine in the 1930s, and during the chaos of World War II. His childhood was defined by poverty, hunger, and trauma. He later claimed that his older brother had been killed and cannibalized by starving neighbors during the famine, though historians have not been able to verify this specific claim. Whether or not that particular detail is true, the environment Chikatilo grew up in was one of extreme deprivation and violence. Despite his difficult beginnings, Chikatilo pursued education. He earned a degree in Russian literature and became a teacher. He later worked as a factory supply clerk and a party organizer. He married and had 2 children. To those around him, he was a quiet, somewhat awkward man who did his job and did not stand out. His first known killing took place on December 22, 1978. The victim was 9-year-old Yelena Zakotnova, who disappeared while walking home from school in Shakhty, a city in the Rostov Oblast. Chikatilo lured her to a vacant house he had secretly purchased. Her body was found 2 days later in the Grushevka River. A young man named Alexander Kravchenko was arrested, tried, and convicted of the murder. He was executed in 1983. This was a catastrophic miscarriage of justice. Soviet investigators, under political pressure to close the case quickly, focused on Kravchenko, who had a prior criminal record, and ignored evidence that pointed elsewhere. It was only years later, after Chikatilo was finally caught, that it became clear an innocent man had been put to death for a crime he did not commit. Throughout the 1980s, Chikatilo continued to kill. He primarily targeted young women and children, approaching them in public places, especially near train and bus stations. He traveled extensively for his job, which involved procurement and supply logistics for a factory, giving him legitimate reasons to move between cities. This mobility made it difficult for investigators to pin down a single suspect. Soviet law enforcement was deeply hampered by the political system of the time. Serial killing was considered a product of Western capitalist society, not something that happened in the Soviet Union. Officially, the Soviet state denied that serial murder existed within its borders. This ideological blind spot meant that resources were slow to be allocated, interagency cooperation was poor, and investigators faced political pressure to resolve cases quickly and quietly, rather than thoroughly. The investigation was led at various points by multiple agencies, but the most persistent investigator was Viktor Burakov, a forensic analyst with the Rostov Oblast Police. Burakov dedicated years of his career to tracking the killer, who had been given the name the Rostov Ripper and the Forest Strip Killer by investigators and the media. Burakov and his team compiled an enormous amount of evidence, but the Soviet bureaucratic system made it difficult to coordinate efforts across jurisdictions. In 1984, Chikatilo was actually detained by police during a surveillance operation at a bus station. Officers noticed him acting suspiciously, approaching young women and children. He was brought in for questioning, and his briefcase was searched. Inside, investigators found a length of rope and a knife. A blood sample was taken. Here is where the story takes one of its most frustrating turns. The blood sample was tested and found to be type A. However, biological evidence collected from several crime scenes indicated the killer had type AB blood. Because the blood types did not match, Chikatilo was released. It was later discovered that Chikatilo was one of a very small number of people who are non-secretors, meaning that their blood type, as determined by blood testing, does not necessarily match the type that would appear in other bodily fluids. This rare biological quirk effectively gave Chikatilo an accidental alibi, and it cost investigators 6 more years and many more lives. Chikatilo was freed and continued killing. The 1984 release of Chikatilo is considered one of the greatest failures of the investigation. He had been in their hands, he had rope and a knife, and he walked out the door because of a laboratory result that was misinterpreted. Throughout the late 1980s, the killings continued, though there were periods of pause that investigators could not explain at the time. Chikatilo later said that he sometimes stopped killing for months or even a year or more, particularly during periods when police activity was high or when he was under personal stress. In November 1990, the investigation reached its conclusion. Police set up undercover surveillance operations at train stations and bus stops across the Rostov Oblast. On November 6, 1990, an undercover officer spotted Chikatilo emerging from a wooded area near a train station in Leskos, looking disheveled and with what appeared to be blood on his face and hands. The officer noted his identity, but did not arrest him immediately. When investigators checked his records, they found that he had been detained in 1984 and that he had been questioned in connection with suspicious behavior on multiple other occasions. On November 20, 1990, Andrei Chikatilo was arrested outside his home. Under interrogation, he initially denied everything, but over the course of several days, he began to confess. Eventually, he admitted to 52 murders committed over 12 years. He described each one in detail, leading investigators to previously undiscovered remains. The trial of Andrei Chikatilo began on April 14, 1992, in a Rostov courtroom. It was a chaotic affair. Chikatilo was placed in a metal cage in the courtroom, a standard practice in Russian trials for dangerous defendants. He behaved erratically during the proceedings, shouting, singing, and at times exposing himself. His behavior raised questions about his mental state, and his defense argued he was insane. However, a panel of psychiatric experts concluded that Chikatilo was sane and fully aware of his actions. On October 15, 1992, he was found guilty of 52 counts of murder and sentenced to death. On February 14, 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot in a prison in Novocherkassk. The Chikatilo case had an enormous impact on Russian law enforcement. It exposed deep flaws in how the Soviet system handled violent crime, including the dangerous consequences of political ideology interfering with criminal investigation. The case also demonstrated the critical importance of forensic science and the need for investigators to understand the limitations of their tools. The blood type mismatch that freed Chikatilo in 1984 could have been resolved with more advanced testing. But the technology and the institutional will to use it were not available. For the families of the victims, and for the community that lived in fear for more than a decade, the case remains a source of profound grief. And the wrongful conviction and execution of Alexander Kravchenko for a crime he did not commit adds another layer of tragedy. Chikatilo walked among the people of the Rostov Oblast as a teacher, a father, and a party member. He traveled on public transportation. He blended into the grayness of Soviet daily life. And when police had him in their hands, a simple laboratory error set him free to continue for 6 more years. His story is a permanent reminder that investigative failures have real, irreversible consequences. Number 11, Kristen Gilbert. In the early 1990s, something strange was happening at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts. The number of cardiac emergencies on Ward C, the medical ward where the most critically ill patients were treated, was rising at an alarming rate. Patients who had been stable were suddenly coding, going into cardiac arrest without any obvious medical explanation, and an unusually high number of those patients were dying. What made the pattern even more unsettling was that the emergencies seemed to cluster around the shifts of one particular nurse. Her name was Kristen Gilbert, and she was not just present during these emergencies. She was often the first one to respond. She was the nurse who called the codes, who performed chest compressions, who shouted for help in the hallways. To some, she looked like a dedicated caretaker working under impossible conditions. To a small but growing group of her colleagues, she looked like something else entirely. Kristen Heather Strickland was born on November 13, 1967, in Fall River, Massachusetts. She grew up in what appeared to be a comfortable middle-class family. She was described as intelligent and driven, and she pursued a career in nursing, eventually earning a degree and securing a position at the Northampton VA Medical Center in 1989. She married Glenn Gilbert in 1988 and had 2 children. At the VA hospital, Kristen quickly established a reputation. She was confident, outspoken, and assertive. She took charge during emergencies and seemed to thrive in high-pressure situations. But it was precisely this pattern that began to raise concerns among her fellow nurses. 3 nurses in particular, Kathy Ricks, Bonnie Bledsoe, and Renee Walsh, began noticing that the number of medical emergencies on the ward spiked dramatically when Kristen was working and dropped when she was not. They also noticed something else. Epinephrine, a powerful drug that stimulates the heart and is commonly used during cardiac emergencies, seemed to be going missing from the ward's medical supplies during Kristen's shifts. Epinephrine, when injected into a patient who does not need it, can cause severe cardiac arrhythmia and death. It is a drug that, if misused, can kill without leaving an obvious trace, because the body produces adrenaline naturally. The 3 nurses did something courageous and difficult. They went to the hospital administration with their concerns. Initially, they were met with skepticism. The suggestion that a nurse was deliberately harming patients was almost too horrifying to consider. But as the data accumulated, the pattern became undeniable between 1989 and 1995, the period during which Kristen Gilbert worked at the facility, there were approximately 350 medical emergencies on Ward C. During the same period, the death rate among patients in her care was significantly higher than the statistical norm. When she was on vacation or called in sick, the emergency rates plummeted. An internal investigation was launched, and the hospital's Inspector General's office contacted the United States Attorney's Office. Federal investigators, including agents from the Department of Veterans Affairs, Office of Inspector General, began a thorough review of the medical records, staffing schedules, and drug logs. During this period, Kristen Gilbert began to unravel personally. She had started an extramarital relationship with a hospital security guard named James Perot. She was aggressive in pursuing the relationship and seemed to revel in the attention she received during medical emergencies, particularly from Perot, who responded to code calls as part of his job. Investigators would later theorize that one of her motives was to create emergencies precisely so that Perot would come to the ward and she could see him. When it became clear that she was under suspicion, Gilbert did not quietly wait for the investigation to conclude. She made a bomb threat against the hospital, calling in a false report in an attempt to disrupt the investigation. The call was traced to a payphone near her home. She was arrested on that charge in 1996 and eventually convicted of making a threatening communication, for which she served a short sentence. The murder investigation continued. Exhumation orders were obtained for the bodies of 3 patients who had died under suspicious circumstances during Gilbert's shifts. Toxicology testing revealed elevated levels of epinephrine, levels far higher than would be expected naturally or through standard medical treatment. The evidence was damning. In 1998, a federal grand jury indicted Kristen Gilbert on 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and 2 counts of attempted murder. Because the crimes occurred at a federal facility, the case was tried in federal court, and the prosecution sought the death penalty. The trial began in November 2000 at the United States District Court in Springfield, Massachusetts. It lasted over 2 months and included testimony from over 70 witnesses. The prosecution presented statistical analysis showing the correlation between Gilbert's shifts and patient deaths. They presented the toxicology evidence. They presented testimony from her former colleagues about the missing epinephrine and the suspicious pattern of emergencies. They presented recordings of the bomb threat she had made. And they presented testimony from James Perot, who described Gilbert's possessive and manipulative behavior. The defense argued that the statistical correlations could be explained by chance, and that the toxicology evidence was not conclusive. They also attempted to paint Gilbert as a dedicated nurse who was being scapegoated by jealous colleagues. On March 14, 2001, the jury found Kristen Gilbert guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. The victims she was convicted of killing were Henry Houdin, Kenneth Cutting, and Stanley Jagodowski in the first-degree charges, and Edward Squira in the second-degree charge. She was also found guilty of 2 counts of attempted murder. In the penalty phase, the jury deliberated on whether Gilbert should receive the death penalty. They ultimately could not reach a unanimous decision, and as a result, Gilbert was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, plus 20 years for the attempted murders. Kristen Gilbert is currently incarcerated at the Federal Medical Center, Carswell, in Fort Worth, Texas. She has shown no public remorse for her actions. The Gilbert case was a watershed moment for the study of healthcare serial killers, a category of offender that is more common than most people realize. Nurses, doctors, and other medical professionals who deliberately harm patients are difficult to detect because they operate in environments where death is expected. Patients in hospitals, particularly veterans with serious health conditions, are already vulnerable. When they die, it is often attributed to their existing medical conditions. It takes an extraordinary level of vigilance from colleagues to recognize the pattern. The courage of the three nurses who first raised the alarm cannot be overstated. They faced professional risk, personal hostility from Gilbert, and institutional resistance. But they persisted because they believed their patients were being harmed. Their actions saved lives and eventually brought a killer to justice. The case also highlighted the importance of statistical analysis in criminal investigation. Sometimes the most powerful evidence is not a fingerprint or a DNA match. Sometimes it is a pattern, a set of numbers that tells a story no individual piece of evidence could tell on its own. In Kristen Gilbert's case, the numbers were impossible to ignore. Number 12, Oscar Pistorius. Oscar Leonard Carl Pistorius was one of the most celebrated athletes of his generation. Born on November 20, 1986, in Sandton, Johannesburg, South Africa, he had both legs amputated below the knee when he was 11 months old due to a congenital condition called fibular hemimelia, in which both fibula bones were missing. Despite this, Pistorius became a world-class sprinter, running on carbon fiber prosthetic blades that earned him the nickname Blade Runner. He competed in both the Paralympic Games and, after a long legal and scientific battle over whether his prosthetic blades gave him an unfair advantage, the Olympic Games. At the 2012 Summer Olympics in London, Pistorius became the first double amputee athlete to compete in the Olympic Games, running in the 400-meter event and the 4x400-meter relay for South Africa. He was a global inspiration. His story of overcoming physical limitation was told and retold by the media around the world. He was sponsored by major brands. He was invited to speak at events alongside world leaders. He was, by any measure, one of the most admired athletes on the planet. And then, on Valentine's Day 2013, everything changed. In the early hours of February 14, 2013, Pistorius fired 4 shots through the locked bathroom door of his home in the Silverwoods Country Estate in Pretoria, South Africa. On the other side of that door was his girlfriend, Riva Steenkamp, a 29-year-old model, television personality, and law graduate. She was struck by 3 of the 4 bullets and died from her injuries. Pistorius called emergency services and attempted first aid, but Riva Steenkamp was pronounced dead at the scene. Within hours, the news had spread around the world. The beloved athlete, the symbol of human determination, had shot and killed his partner. What followed was one of the most closely watched criminal cases in South African history, and indeed one of the most followed cases anywhere in the world. Pistorius's defense was built around a single claim. He said that he woke in the middle of the night and heard noises in the bathroom. He said he believed an intruder had entered the home through the bathroom window. He said he grabbed his firearm, moved toward the bathroom, and fired through the locked door to protect himself and Riva. He said he did not realize Riva was in the bathroom. He said he thought she was still in bed. The prosecution painted a very different picture. They argued that Pistorius and Steenkamp had been arguing that night. Neighbors testified that they had heard a woman screaming and a man shouting before the gunshots. The prosecution argued that Pistorius knew Riva was in the bathroom when he fired and that the killing was intentional. The trial began on March 3, 2014, before Judge Thokozile Masipa in the Pretoria High Court. South Africa does not use a jury system. The case was decided by the judge with the assistance of 2 assessors. The trial was broadcast live on television, and it captivated audiences across the globe. The prosecution, led by Jerry Nell, presented testimony from neighbors who heard screams and banging sounds before the gunshots. They presented ballistic evidence showing the trajectory of the bullets and their devastating impact. They presented cell phone records and WhatsApp messages between Pistorius and Steenkamp that suggested the relationship had been troubled at times, with Steenkamp expressing fear of Pistorius's temper. The defense, led by Barry Rue, presented testimony from security experts, forensic analysts, and acoustic experts who challenged the neighbors' accounts. They argued that the sounds neighbors attributed to screaming could have been Pistorius himself screaming in a high-pitched voice after realizing what he had done. They presented evidence about Pistorius's vulnerability without his prosthetic legs and his heightened sense of insecurity about intruders. On September 12, 2014, Judge Masipa delivered her verdict. She found Pistorius not guilty of premeditated murder, accepting that the state had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Pistorius knew Riva was behind the door when he fired. However, she found him guilty of culpable homicide, which is roughly equivalent to manslaughter. She said that even if Pistorius believed an intruder was present, his decision to fire through a closed door without identifying his target was grossly negligent. On October 21, 2014, Pistorius was sentenced to 5 years in prison for culpable homicide. The sentence was widely criticized as too lenient, both in South Africa and internationally. Many felt that the man's celebrity status had influenced the outcome. The prosecution appealed the verdict, and the case went to the Supreme Court of Appeal. On December 3, 2015, the Supreme Court of Appeal overturned the culpable homicide conviction and replaced it with a conviction for murder, specifically dolus eventualis, which means Pistorius must have foreseen the possibility that his actions would kill whoever was behind the door and proceeded anyway. The court held that a reasonable person in his position would have foreseen this outcome and that his actions went beyond negligence into the territory of murder. Pistorius was sentenced to 6 years in prison for murder on July 6, 2016. The prosecution again appealed, arguing the sentence was shockingly lenient. On November 24, 2017, the Supreme Court of Appeal increased the sentence to 15 years, minus time already served. This meant Pistorius would serve a total of 13 years and 5 months. Pistorius was incarcerated at the Atteridgeville Correctional Center in Pretoria. On January 5, 2024, he was released on parole after serving approximately 10 years, having been granted parole by the South African Department of Correctional Services. His release was met with mixed reactions. Riva Steenkamp's parents, Barry and June Steenkamp, expressed their grief and their feeling that justice had not been fully served. The Pistorius case is significant for many reasons beyond the individual tragedy. It exposed the tension between celebrity and accountability. It raised important questions about South African criminal law, gun ownership, and domestic violence. South Africa has extremely high rates of violence against women, and the Pistorius case became a focal point for advocacy and awareness. It also demonstrated how a public figure can shape the narrative around their own case. Pistorius wept openly in court. He vomited during testimony. He appeared broken and remorseful. Whether these displays were genuine or calculated was debated endlessly by legal analysts and the public. But the fact remains that his fame and his image as an inspirational figure created a kind of gravitational field that influenced how people perceived the case. Riva Steenkamp's parents have dedicated their lives to honoring her memory. They established the Riva Steenkamp Foundation, which supports victims of domestic violence. They have spoken publicly about their daughter, about who she was as a person, about her intelligence, her compassion, and her dreams for the future. They have made it clear that for them, this case was never about Oscar Pistorius. It was always about Riva, and that is perhaps the most important takeaway. When a famous person is involved in a crime, the fame itself becomes part of the story. The cameras follow the celebrity, not the victim. The headlines carry the famous name, not the one that was lost. The Steenkamp family has worked tirelessly to correct that imbalance, and their efforts deserve recognition. Number 13, Robert Napper. On July 15, 1992, 23-year-old Rachel Nichol was walking with her 2-year-old son, Alex, on Wimbledon Common in southwest London. It was a bright summer morning. The Common was a popular spot for families, joggers, and dog walkers. Rachel had her dog with her. It should have been a perfectly ordinary outing. Rachel Nichol never came home. She was found on the Common having been attacked in an extremely violent manner. Her young son, Alex, was found clinging to her, covered in blood, saying, "Wake up, Mummy." It was one of the most harrowing crime scenes officers had ever encountered, and the image of that little boy beside his mother became seared into the consciousness of the entire nation. The case received massive media coverage. The public demanded answers. The Metropolitan Police came under enormous pressure to find the killer quickly, and in their rush to produce results, they made a series of decisions that would become one of the most notorious investigative failures in British criminal history. Rather than following the evidence methodically, the investigation became focused on a man named Colin Stagg, a local resident who was known to walk on Wimbledon Common and who had a somewhat eccentric personality. Stagg became the primary suspect, not because of strong physical evidence, but because of a psychological profile created by criminal psychologist Paul Britton, who believed the killer would match certain behavioral characteristics. In an extraordinary step, the Metropolitan Police launched an undercover operation known as Operation Edsel. A female undercover officer, using the pseudonym Lizzie James, was instructed to befriend Colin Stagg and, over a period of months, attempt to draw out a confession by feigning a romantic interest and a shared fascination with violence. The operation involved extensive correspondence and meetings, during which the undercover officer attempted to get Stagg to make incriminating statements. Stagg never confessed. He made various statements during the operation that prosecutors believed were incriminating, but when the case came to trial at the Old Bailey in September 1994, Judge Mr. Justice Ognall threw out the prosecution's case entirely. He described the undercover operation as a skillful and sustained enterprise to manipulate the accused, and said the conduct of the investigation amounted to entrapment. The case against Colin Stagg was dismissed, and he was acquitted. Colin Stagg had spent over a year in custody as an innocent man. Even after his acquittal, he was hounded by the media and the public, who continued to believe he was guilty. His life was effectively destroyed. He could not go out in public without being recognized and harassed. He lived in fear and isolation for years, and while all of this was happening, the real killer was free. His name was Robert Napper. Robert Clive Napper was born on February 25, 1966, in Erith, Kent, England. His childhood was deeply troubled. He was subjected to abuse and neglect, and he displayed behavioral problems from a young age. As an adult, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and Asperger's syndrome, a combination that profoundly affected his ability to function in society and his perception of reality. Napper had come to the attention of police before Rachel Nickell's murder. In 1989, a woman had reported to the Metropolitan Police that Napper had assaulted her on Plumstead Common in southeast London. The report was taken but not effectively followed up. In 1992, before Rachel Nickell was killed, Napper's mother actually called police to tell them her son had admitted to a serious sexual assault. Again, the information was recorded but not properly actioned. These missed opportunities would later be identified as critical failings. On November 3, 1993, more than a year after Rachel Nickell's murder, Napper broke into the home of Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter, Jasmine, in Plumstead, southeast London. He killed both of them in an attack of extreme violence. The murder of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett was investigated by a different team within the Metropolitan Police, and for a time, it was not connected to the Rachel Nickell case. The investigation into the Bissett murders was more effective than the Nickell investigation had been. Forensic evidence, including a fingerprint found at the scene, eventually led investigators to Robert Napper. On May 27, 1994, Napper was arrested and charged with the murders of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett. In October 1995, Robert Napper pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He was sentenced to be detained indefinitely at Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility in Berkshire. But the Rachel Nickell case remained officially unsolved. It was not until advances in DNA technology in the mid-2000s that investigators were finally able to revisit the evidence. Forensic testing conducted on material recovered from the Wimbledon common crime scene produced a DNA profile that matched Robert Napper. The evidence was conclusive. On December 18, 2008, Robert Napper appeared at the Old Bailey and pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Rachel Nickel on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He was ordered to remain at Broadmoor Hospital indefinitely, where he had already been detained for the Bissett murders. The aftermath of the case was devastating for the Metropolitan Police. An independent review, conducted by the Independent Police Complaints Commission, and later by Sir Christopher Rose, identified a catalog of failures. The investigation had been derailed by tunnel vision, specifically the fixation on Colin Stagg to the exclusion of other suspects. The undercover operation was condemned as inappropriate and ethically questionable. The failure to connect Napper to both the Nickel and Bissett cases, despite the similarities, was described as a systemic breakdown in intelligence sharing. Colin Stagg eventually received compensation from the Metropolitan Police for his wrongful arrest and the destruction of his reputation. In 2008, after Napper's guilty plea, Stagg spoke publicly about the years of suffering he had endured. His story became a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of confirmation bias in criminal investigation. For the family of Rachel Nickel, the resolution brought some measure of closure but could never undo the pain. Her son, Alex Hanscombe, grew up without his mother. He was raised by his father, Andrei Hanscombe, who moved to France to escape the media attention. Alex has spoken publicly as an adult about his memories and his grief, and his courage in doing so has been widely admired. The Napper case is one of the clearest examples in modern criminal history of what happens when an investigation goes wrong from the start. The police were so convinced they had the right man that they ignored evidence pointing to someone else. They used ethically questionable tactics. They wasted years pursuing Colin Stagg while Robert Napper remained free and, during that time, killed again. The deaths of Samantha and Jasmine Bissett might have been prevented if the Rachel Nickel investigation had been conducted properly from the beginning. It is a painful lesson, but an essential one. When investigators become committed to a theory before the evidence supports it, they do not just risk failing to solve the case. They risk allowing the real perpetrator to continue causing harm. The Napper case changed how the Metropolitan Police approach criminal investigations, and its lessons are taught to this day in police training programs across the United Kingdom. Number 14. Paul Bernardo. Paul Kenneth Bernardo was charming, well-dressed, and handsome. He had a university degree in accounting from the University of Toronto, Scarborough. He drove a nice car. He lived in a comfortable home in the suburban city of St. Catharines, Ontario. He was married to Carla Homolka, a young woman who was attractive and seemingly sweet. To their neighbors, they were the perfect couple. People called them Ken and Barbie, comparing them to the idealized dolls. Behind the doors of their home at 57 Bayview Drive, a nightmare was unfolding that would become one of the most horrifying criminal cases in Canadian history. Paul Bernardo was born on August 27, 1964, in Scarborough, Ontario. His childhood was troubled. His family life was dysfunctional, and there are indications that he was subjected to emotional and psychological turmoil at home. As a young man, he developed deeply disturbing attitudes toward women, attitudes that began manifesting in violence long before anyone connected the dots. Between 1987 and 1990, a series of sexual assaults terrorized the Scarborough area of Toronto. The attacker, who became known as the Scarborough Rapist, targeted young women, often attacking them near bus stops late at night. The assaults were brutal, and the community was terrified. Police formed a task force and collected thousands of tips. Bernardo's name first came to police attention in November 1990, when a friend of his tipped off the Metropolitan Toronto Police that Bernardo bore a strong resemblance to a composite sketch of the Scarborough rapist. Detectives interviewed Bernardo, and he was cooperative, friendly, and utterly convincing. He provided blood, saliva, and hair samples for forensic testing. And then, because of an enormous backlog at the Center of Forensic Sciences in Toronto, those samples sat untested for over 2 years. This delay would prove catastrophic. While his samples waited in a laboratory queue, Bernardo escalated from assault to murder. He had met Karla Homolka in October 1987, and they quickly became a couple. Homolka, who was 17 at the time, became deeply enmeshed in Bernardo's world. The exact nature of their relationship, whether Homolka was a willing accomplice from the start or a victim of Bernardo's control who became complicit over time, remains one of the most debated questions in Canadian criminal history. In December 1990, the couple was involved in the death of Karla's own sister, Tammy Homolka. They drugged Tammy with a veterinary sedative that Karla had stolen from the animal clinic where she worked. Tammy had an adverse reaction and choked. She died at the age of 15. The death was ruled accidental at the time, attributed to aspiration after consuming alcohol. The truth about what happened that night would not come to light until years later. In June 1991, the couple abducted 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey from her home in Burlington, Ontario. Leslie had been locked out of her house after missing her curfew. Bernardo and Homolka took her to their home, where she was held captive, assaulted, and eventually killed. Her remains were encased in concrete blocks and dumped in Lake Gibson near St. Catharines. When the blocks were discovered by a canoeist on June 29, 1991, the case sent shockwaves through the region. Almost exactly 1 year later, on April 16, 1992, the couple abducted 15-year-old Kristen French from a church parking lot in St. Catharines in broad daylight. Witnesses saw a cream-colored Chevrolet Camaro and a woman with a map asking for directions, a ruse used to distract Kristen while Bernardo grabbed her. Kristen was held captive for approximately 2 weeks before she was killed. Her body was found on April 30, 1992, in a ditch in Burlington. The abduction and murder of Kristen French, coming so soon after the Leslie Mahaffey case, created a massive investigation. The Niagara Regional Police and the Ontario Provincial Police formed a joint task force called the Green Ribbon Task Force, named for the green ribbons the community tied around trees in memory of the victims. Thousands of tips poured in. Hundreds of suspects were investigated, but Paul Bernardo, despite living in the area and driving a car that matched witness descriptions, was not identified as the primary suspect for these murders during this period. Why? Because the forensic samples from the Scarborough rapist investigation were still sitting untested in the laboratory. In December 1992, nearly 2 years after the samples were collected, the Center of Forensic Sciences finally tested Bernardo's DNA. The results confirmed that Paul Bernardo was the Scarborough rapist. But by the time investigators received this confirmation and connected Bernardo to the broader pattern, events had already taken another turn. Karla Homolka left Bernardo in January 1993 after he beat her severely. She went to her parents' home and then to a hospital. The injuries were visible and documented. Police were called, and Homolka eventually began cooperating with investigators. What she told them was devastating. She described the abductions, captivity, and murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. She described her own role, though she carefully positioned herself as a coerced victim of Bernardo's violence. In exchange for her cooperation and testimony against Bernardo, prosecutors offered Homolka what became known as the deal with the devil. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter and received a sentence of 12 years. The deal was made before prosecutors were aware of the full extent of Homolka's involvement, and before they knew about the videotapes. The videotapes were the most damning evidence in the case. Bernardo had recorded the assaults on videotape. He had hidden the tapes in a ceiling fixture at the house before his arrest. Bernardo's lawyer, Ken Murray, retrieved the tapes from the house. Murray held onto them for over a year before turning them over to the court after replacing himself as counsel, a decision that became the subject of its own legal and ethical controversy. When prosecutors finally viewed the tapes, They revealed that Homolka's participation was far more active and enthusiastic than she had described in her statements. The public was outraged, but the plea deal had already been signed and could not be undone. Paul Bernardo's trial began on May 1, 1995, at the Ontario Court of Justice in Toronto. The proceedings were covered extensively by the media, though a publication ban prevented the reporting of certain details in Canada at the time. The evidence was overwhelming, including the videotapes, Homolka's testimony, forensic evidence, and Bernardo's own statements. On September 1, 1995, Paul Bernardo was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated sexual assault, 2 counts of forcible confinement, and other charges. He was sentenced to life in prison and was designated a dangerous offender under Canadian law, a classification that makes release virtually impossible. He was also eventually identified and acknowledged as the Scarborough rapist, with those crimes formally connected to him through DNA evidence. The full scope of his offending, spanning years in multiple jurisdictions, was finally established. Karla Homolka served her full 12-year sentence and was released from prison on July 4, 2005. Her release was enormously controversial. She changed her name, moved to Quebec, and later reportedly lived in the Caribbean for a time before returning to Canada. Reports surfaced that she was living in a suburb of Montreal with a new partner and children. The knowledge that she was free while her victims' families continued to grieve remains a source of deep pain and public anger. The Bernardo case led to significant reforms in the Canadian justice system. The Campbell Report, authored by Justice Archie Campbell, examined the investigative failures and concluded that the most critical problem was the lack of coordination between police forces. The forensic sample backlog at the Center of Forensic Sciences was identified as a direct contributor to the delay in identifying Bernardo. The report led to changes in how DNA evidence is processed and prioritized in Canada, as well as improvements in interagency communication. For the families of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, and for the family of Tammy Homolka, the case represents an unimaginable loss. Debbie and Dan Mahaffey and Doug and Donna French showed extraordinary strength throughout the trial and in the years since, advocating for victims' rights and speaking publicly about the human cost of systemic failure. The Paul Bernardo case is a devastating reminder of what happens when the system moves too slowly. His DNA was in police hands in 1990. If it had been tested promptly, the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French might never have happened. That knowledge is the most painful part of this entire story, because it means those deaths were not just tragic. They were preventable. Number 15. Cameron Hooker. In May 1977, a 20-year-old woman named Colleen Stan was hitchhiking from Eugene, Oregon, to a friend's birthday party in Northern California. She had been on the road for a while and was being cautious about which rides she accepted. When a young couple with an infant in the car pulled over and offered her a lift, Colleen felt safe enough to accept. The couple seemed normal. They seemed harmless. The woman smiled at her. The baby was quiet in the back seat. The man behind the wheel was Cameron Hooker. The woman was his wife, Janice Hooker, and what happened next would be one of the most disturbing cases of abduction and captivity in American criminal history. Cameron Hooker was born on November 5, 1953, and raised in the Red Bluff, California area. He worked at a lumber mill. He was quiet and unassuming. Neighbors thought of him as a regular, somewhat introverted man. Janice was a young woman who had become deeply enmeshed in Cameron's world and was, by her own later account, terrified of him. Shortly after Colleen got into the car, Cameron Hooker stopped the vehicle on a remote stretch of road and overpowered her. He placed a wooden box over her head, a device he had built himself. From that moment, Colleen Stan's freedom was taken from her, and she would not regain it for more than 7 years. Hooker brought Colleen to his home on 1140 Oak Street in Red Bluff, California. He confined her in a wooden box that he had built beneath the bed he shared with Janice. The box was roughly the size of a coffin, measuring about 7 feet long, 3 feet wide, and less than 3 feet deep. Colleen spent up to 23 hours a day inside that box for extended periods, existing in near total darkness, in extreme temperatures, with minimal food and water. Over time, Hooker employed a sophisticated program of psychological manipulation to control Colleen. He told her that he was a member of a secretive organization called the Company, which, he claimed, monitored people and would harm her family if she ever tried to escape or tell anyone about her captivity. He made her sign a contract of servitude. He convinced her that she was being watched at all times, and that escape was not only futile, but would result in the deaths of her loved ones. This level of psychological control is sometimes referred to as coercive control, and it is important to understand how it works. Over time, when a person is isolated from the outside world, subjected to severe physical conditions, and told repeatedly that they are helpless, their ability to perceive options and possibilities is fundamentally altered. Colleen was not physically chained to the house at all times. There were periods, later in her captivity, when she was allowed some limited movement. But the psychological chains were far more effective than any physical restraint. In fact, one of the most remarkable and often misunderstood aspects of this case is that Hooker eventually allowed Colleen to get a part-time job at a motel in Red Bluff. She worked there under a false name. She interacted with customers. She was, to outward appearances, a free person. But she did not run. She did not tell anyone. She believed completely and totally that the company would harm her family if she did anything. Even more remarkably, Hooker allowed Colleen to visit her family. In March 1981, nearly 4 years into her captivity, Colleen called her family on the phone. She told them she was living in Northern California with friends and was doing fine. Later, Hooker actually drove Colleen to her family's home in Riverside, California, and waited in the car while she visited. Her family was relieved to see her alive, but did not suspect anything was wrong. Colleen did not ask for help. She believed, with absolute conviction, that if she did, her family would be killed. This is the aspect of the case that people find most difficult to understand. How could someone in that situation not reach out for help when they were standing right in front of their own family? The answer lies in the nature of psychological captivity. Hooker had spent years systematically dismantling Colleen's sense of agency, her belief in her own ability to act, and her trust in the outside world. He had created a prison without walls, and it was, in many ways, more effective than any physical cell. The turning point in the case came not from law enforcement or outside intervention, but from Janice Hooker. After years of living with Cameron's escalating behavior and her own complicity in Colleen's captivity, Janice reached a breaking point. She had become increasingly involved in a local church and had developed a relationship with her pastor. The moral weight of what was happening in her home became unbearable. In August 1984, Janice told Colleen the truth. She told her that the company did not exist. She told her that Cameron had invented the entire thing. She told Colleen she was free to leave. The effect was immediate and devastating. The psychological framework that had kept Colleen captive for more than 7 years collapsed in an instant. She was free. She left the Hooker home and eventually went to the police, though initially she was reluctant to do so because she feared no one would believe her. Janice Hooker also went to the authorities. She provided a detailed account of Cameron's actions, including the construction of the box, the psychological manipulation, and the years of captivity. Her testimony would become the most critical element of the prosecution's case. Cameron Hooker was arrested in November 1984. He was charged with kidnapping, sexual assault, and other offenses related to the captivity of Colleen Stan. The trial took place in 1985 in the Tehama County Superior Court in Red Bluff. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Christine McGuire, presented a detailed case built on Janice's testimony, Colleen's testimony, and physical evidence from the Hooker home, including the box itself. The defense argued that Colleen had stayed voluntarily and that the relationship however unusual, was consensual. This argument was aggressively challenged by the prosecution, which presented expert testimony on coercive control and the psychology of captivity. The jury deliberated and, on November 18, 1985, found Cameron Hooker guilty of kidnapping and multiple other charges. He was sentenced to 104 years in state prison. Janice Hooker received immunity from prosecution in exchange for her testimony. She was never charged with a crime. Cameron Hooker has been imprisoned at the California State Prison System since his conviction. He became eligible for parole in 2015 and has had parole hearings since then. As of my last reliable information, he remained incarcerated, though parole hearings in California can be scheduled periodically for inmates who have served their minimum terms. Colleen Stan survived her ordeal and rebuilt her life. She has spoken publicly about her experience, including in media interviews and in the book, The Perfect Victim, written by Christine McGuire and Carla Norton, which documented the case in detail. Her courage in testifying and in sharing her story publicly has been instrumental in advancing understanding of coercive control and psychological captivity. The case of Cameron Hooker and Colleen Stan changed how many people think about captivity and control. It challenged the assumption that a person who is not physically restrained must be free. It demonstrated that psychological manipulation can be as binding as any chain, and that the question of why a victim did not simply leave is not only unhelpful, but fundamentally misunderstands the nature of coercive control. This case also influenced legal thinking about what constitutes captivity. Before cases like this one, the law often required evidence of physical restraint to prove kidnapping or false imprisonment. The Hooker case helped expand the legal understanding to include psychological coercion as a form of confinement. Every case in this video has shown us a different way that the line between hunter and hunted can blur. Some of the people we covered actively helped investigate their own crimes. Some socialized with the officers looking for them. Some manipulated the media. Some exploited the trust of their communities. And some, like Cameron Hooker, built a prison so invisible that even the victim's own family could not see it. These cases are difficult to hear about, but they are important. They teach us that appearances can be deceiving in the most dangerous ways imaginable. They remind us that justice systems, while essential, are imperfect and require constant vigilance and improvement. And most of all, they remind us that the people who suffer most in these stories, the victims and their families, deserve to have their stories told with accuracy, respect, and care. If you have stayed with us through all 15 cases, thank you. The world is safer when people understand how these things happen, because understanding is the first step toward prevention.